welcome and thank you for being part of WorkSafe's How to Prepare a Safe Work Method Statement for High-Risk Construction Work webinar. My name is Cameron Ling and I'll be your host for this session. Now today I'm joined by Rick Fisher, Technical Inspector, Renewable Energy Construction Team. Rick works on renewable energy sector projects across Victoria and was previously a construction inspector working in Melbourne's East. Good morning to you, Rick.
Good morning, Cameron.
I keep getting that wrong every time. It's now good afternoon, but it's okay. We know what time of the day it is, don't we, Rick?
Good morning, sorry.
Exactly right. Rick also has industry experience in telecommunications, installation, maintenance and management, civil and modular construction, network construction, restoration and biodecontamination. He is a member of the Australian Institute of Health and Safety and has a master's degree in occupational health, safety and environmental management. And in his spare time, he volunteers in scouting, goes rock climbing and does martial arts. I don't know how you fit all of that in, Rick, but it's very, very impressive.
Thanks, Cameron.
It's great to have you with us. Now, this session, a really important session today, and in the first half of our session, we'll cover information for businesses in the construction sector to help you understand how and when to prepare a safe work method statement for high-risk construction work. We're going to explore the following topics with Rick: what a safe work method statement is, the types of roles across the construction sector that are required to complete a safe work method statement, and also the importance of developing, using and updating it as comprehensively as you can. Then we're going to open it up to you, the audience, to ask questions. Rick, by way of background, I see that safe work method statements are primarily used in the construction sector as a document that gives specific instructions on how to safely perform an activity that is considered as high-risk construction work. The statement is developed by work teams undertaking high-risk construction work, outlining a task or process and providing detailed guidance on how to carry it out safely. In Victoria, it is required as part of our legislation to develop a safe work method statement prior to high-risk construction work commencing, refer to it, review it, and also to update it when required. So, Rick, could I ask you to start by giving us a brief legislative background to set the scene about the broad obligations employers have?
Thanks, Cameron, of course. So under the OH&S laws in Victoria, which is made up of the OHS Act and the OH&S regulations, employers have a duty, so far as is reasonably practical, to provide and maintain for their employees a working environment that's safe and without risk to health, and that includes mental health issues as well. So this includes providing employees with suitable information, instruction, training and supervision to enable them to perform their work safely.
Thanks for that background, Rick. It's great to hear that. We're talking today about providing two different types of information, instruction and training: the general duty under the OHS Act and the duty to prepare a safe work method statement, also known as a SWMS. What is the difference between the two?
Okay, so it's a great question, Cameron, and a general duty is what's provided under the Act, and we talk about things like our Section 21. And a general duty would be to provide information, instruction and training, and it's not necessarily limited to high-risk construction work, but to all work that is undertaken within the workplace. And that might include things like how to use a nail gun, for instance, or how to fit a dust mask safely and do a proper fit test so that it's effective in its use.
We're concentrating today on high-risk environments, for example, construction sites with mobile plant. I understand that SWMS are only required for undertaking high-risk construction work on construction sites, and these are a legal requirement of employers. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I've actually got a short animation here that might help to describe it, so I think maybe if we play that now.
A Safe Work Method Statement, or SWMS, is a legally required document that must be completed before commencing specific high-risk construction activities. The OH&S regulations have identified these 19 activities as they have a long history or recognised high potential of causing death or serious injury in construction work. A Safe Work Method Statement should clearly outline the high-risk construction work to be carried out, the hazards that could arise from these activities, and how you will control those risks. Swims don't have to be large and complex. They should be easily understood by all people involved in the task and remain readily accessible to them while the task is undertaken. To make it easier for your business to create a safe work method statement, visit worksafe.vic.gov.au and download WorkSafe's new SWIMS template. You can also find resources and helpful information on completing your SWIMS. Completing a SWIMS before commencing high-risk construction work is not just a legal obligation. It also allows your team to think about the tasks, understand the risks, and approach them as safely as possible. And that leads to safer workplaces all across Victoria.
Okay, Rick, that makes it very clear. Could I just get you to clarify one thing? What is the difference between a SWIMS and a general duty?
Yeah, sure, Cameron. It's a little bit about the relationship between the regulations and the Act. So the regulations refer to the Act in the sections. So a safe work method statement is legally required under regulations 327 through to 329, and they must be completed before commencing specific high-risk construction activities. And there's 19 of those. So, for example, to undertake working at height greater than 2 metres, and that's where the workers' boots are going to be above 2 metres, we'd identify that as being one of the 19 activities we just saw in the video, and therefore there'd be a SWIMS would be completed. The primary purpose of a SWIMS is to help supervisors, workers and the other persons at the workplace to understand the requirements that have been established to carry out that high-risk construction work in the safest way possible. So what controls are going to have in place? As discussed, the general duty to provide information, instruction and training might include training on how to wear a dust mask or a nail gun, but it's not limited to high-risk construction work. So SWIMS is quite specific to high-risk construction work, and a general duty is overarching within construction.
I appreciate that clarification, Rick. Thank you for that. It's my understanding that SWIMS guidance and the template has just been updated by WorkSafe. What do employers need to know that's new?
Okay, I've actually got a graphic here that we might put up. The new guidance is clearer. It uses simple language, provides a step-by-step approach and an editable template. Don't want to say that 3 times. Okay, so you can see on the graphic on the screen there that we've got the header screen of the template, and that has information that allows the duty holder to put details about the site, because it should be site-specific, about the duty holder, and it lists the 19 high-risk construction activities.
That sounds helpful there. Appreciate you sharing that with us. So whose responsibility is it to prepare a SWIMS before high-risk construction work?
Okay, so that's a great question, and look, there's multiple people involved in this. So to ensure that a SWIMS is prepared prior to the SWIMS commencing, the employers, so the employer, the people or the employees intending to undertake the high-risk construction work have a duty to ensure it's prepared and be involved with that preparation. Self-employed persons, the self-employed person, or if they've engaged contractors and they're intending to undertake high-risk construction work. With labour hire, and this is where it can get a little bit tricky, both the employer, direct employer, and the host employer of the employees intending to undertake the high-risk construction work need to ensure that SWIMS has been prepared. For the direct employer, they need to make sure that the host employer has that system of work in place, because they might not actually know what the work being conducted under the SWIMS is. And sometimes we just need to clarify that point. In practice, though, whoever's most familiar with the high-risk construction activity to be performed should be involved with developing that SWIMS. That includes the supervisors, the workers themselves, if they've got a health and safety representative, and it should be done in a consultative manner.
So, Rick, when we've established that we need to complete a SWIMS for undertaking the high-risk construction activity, what should employers remember here?
Yeah, look, that's a great question. Excuse me. The SWIMS is prepared prior to the high-risk construction work commencing. It's no point doing it halfway through because you haven't considered the risks. The high-risk construction work then needs to be performed in accordance with the SWIM. So the SWIM is going to list controls. So things like we need a handrail, we need to know that handrail is in place. If the high-risk construction work deviates from the SWIM, so something changes, then the work needs to stop immediately. And at that point, there's a couple of options. The high-risk construction work can't resume until they either review the SWIMs and you may revise them, or you change the work method to actually meet the controls within the SWIMs. The other time that has to happen, then also the duty holder, in consultation with the affected employees and the health and safety reps, need to review and revise any time there is a significant change or if there's been an incident on site. The other two, and this one particularly is really important, is that the duty holder must retain a copy of the SWIMs for the duration that high-risk construction work's being undertaken. And more importantly, it needs to be available at the location where the high-risk construction work's being done. It's no point up in head office. The guys down on the ground doing the work need to be able to have a look at it and access it. They can have an electronic copy, but I always recommend having some paper as well because it's easier to write on paper than a screen.
That's a good point you make. So how do you go about preparing a SWIMS?
Okay, I've actually got a graphic here that we might bring up and I'll speak to that. There's a couple of important things to remember. The first is to bring together the relevant employees, the HSRs and supervisors at the location of the proposed works, if possible. The reason we want to do it on location is to review those proposed works to pick up any site-specific factors. So there might be as an example, you might have somebody using a piling rig next to where the guys are working, and that wasn't there when they thought about this initial work. They need to also ensure all the high-risk construction work activities that are being undertaken are identified and the hazards are listed. So it might be working at heights, working where you've got a trench more than 1.5 metres in depth. And they need to select the risk controls and measures and describe them alongside each of the hazards that are listed. And then assess, review and update the SWIMs if anything changes on site, for example, weather or scope of work. Handwritten amendments can be made on site and that's completely acceptable.
Great, thanks, Rick. To control the hazards of the high-risk construction work that you're talking about, employers should use the hierarchy of control, which is a recognised system used in industry to minimise or eliminate exposure. But could you tell us, how does a hierarchy of control work to protect workers? I believe you might even have a short video that might explain it, Rick.
Yep, you're spot on, Cameron. I do. Let's pop that video up now.
In the last decade, falls from heights accounted for 27 fatalities in the construction industry. Here's how to implement a hierarchy of control to protect you and your workers. First, identify any task that may involve a fall hazard and implement the highest level of safety protection possible. There are 5 safety control levels that can be applied to any worksite that contains a fall risk. Level 1 eliminates the risk of a fall entirely. Working at ground level or on solid construction, using long-handled tools or extension poles for tools. Level 2 requires using fall prevention devices like scaffolding, guard railing, or elevated work platforms. Level 3 combines controls, using work positioning systems like industrial rope access and travel restraint systems. Level 4 doesn't prevent falls, it arrests them, using industrial safety nets, catch platforms, and safety harnesses. Level 5 requires the use of a ladder. Almost 40% of falls from heights in construction involve ladders, so you must ensure they are fit for purpose, appropriate for the task's duration, and set up correctly. For all control levels, a safe system of work must be implemented. If the fall risk exceeds 2 metres, a safe work method statement must be used. And remember, levels 2 through 5 require an emergency procedure to rescue the person and to provide first aid immediately. To protect your workers and yourself, visit the WorkSafe website.
So what you can see on that video, and let's just summarise, we want to eliminate the risk if we possibly can, because if we eliminate the risk, that's always going to be the best outcome. And that might be as simple as, can we use a machine to do a job, say to lay a cable, rather than a person getting in a trench to lay that cable, would be an example. We can reduce the risk through that remain, if we can't eliminate it, through substitution. So using other sorts of equipment or materials that might, in the case of a trench, it means the employee doesn't actually have to get into the trench to do that work. Isolation, so if they're working in and around traffic, that we put the concrete crash barriers in place. So that's actually isolating the worker from the vehicles and having that proper traffic lane and management in place. Engineering controls, working at height, for example, that we put safety rails or a scaffold around would be a simple engineering solution. They're the above the line sort of things that we like to see. If we can't do any of those and there's still a risk, then it becomes things like administrative controls, such things as training, as signage, and if all else fails, we go down to personal protective equipment. So people talk a lot about PPE, making sure that's right, but at the end of the day, we want to eliminate as many risks as possible before we need to actually implement PPE. And any admin or PPE control isn't going to stop something happening, but it's hopefully going to minimise the effect.
That makes a lot of sense, Rick. Thank you for that. Can a SWIMS address matters other than high-risk construction work?
That's a great question, Cam. And to be honest, it's probably the one that we're asked more frequently than almost anything else. So look, only hazards and risks that are directly related to high-risk construction work need to be included in a SWIMS. That's what's in the regulations. Non-high-risk construction work and risk can be included if it's helpful. However, it shouldn't occur to such an extent that you're losing focus on the high-risk construction work. I've just got a graphic here that shows a little bit of what to do and what not to do. So the first one you can see here, it's pretty busy. There's a whole lot of stuff up there on the screen. We've got extra rows talking about risk ratings and residual risks. And at the end of the day, a lot of that stuff's subjective. It doesn't really tell the story. And the things that this one's addressing, it's not high-risk construction work. So if we flick through to the new an example on our new template, you can see this is laid out really clearly. There's a risk up the top that's talking about working at heights. It's got the task involved, what the hazards are, the controls that we expect, who and how it's going to be implemented. Then underneath there was, okay, we also had one other thing we needed to do on the site, which in this case was induct a worker to site. So it's a nice, simple example. You haven't lost focus on your high-risk construction work. It's there at the top. And if you have that, you can pop that extra one in. But realistically, is what we'd love to see is if people have got a whole lot of things that are safety-based, but they're not high-risk construction work, you put them in a separate document, like a standard operating procedure or a safety plan, and leave the SWIMS for the SWIMS.
Rick, can I ask, what is a generic SWIMS, and is it acceptable to use one of those?
Yeah, look, a generic SWIMS, so if I'm regularly doing roof tiling as an example, a lot of the risks that I would see would be very much the same. So a generic SWIMS is prepared and it seeks to address a whole range of hazards that are specific to a specific high-risk construction work activity. For it to be acceptable, though, it still needs to be amended on site because it needs to be site-specific. So having a generic as a starter, I don't have an issue with, but is what we do need to see is that when they get to site, there's that consultation with the guys doing the work and that it's then filled in and there's reasonable consideration given to the on-site risks and those hazards that are identified and, if required, controls put in place.
Rick, what advice would you give to perhaps smaller construction operators who might claim that SWIMS are complex and not easily understood by workers?
Look, the most easy answer for that, Cameron, is to follow the KISS principle. Keep it super simple. It doesn't have to be complex. It does not have to be a 52-page document to tell me that I don't want to work above 2 metres without rail. So it's take all those other things that we're just talking about out, keep the SWIMS specific for the higher risk construction work, identify the hazards and ensure the controls are in place, understand what's in it. So brief the workers that are doing the work, and then use the guidance and template to address the high-risk construction work.
And also, Rick, what other resources does WorkSafe provide to make it easy for employers to create a safe work method statement before they commence the high-risk construction work?
That's another great question, Cameron. You've been well queued up today. So the first one, and we've got a couple of graphics here, so I might just pop them up as we go. So we've got the new guidance document, and it explains over about I think 6 pages how to prepare a SWMS, what's involved, and it can be filled in electronically and then downloaded or printed and then taken to site. The snapshot here, we saw the header page earlier, and this is you can see on this graphic, it lists in the columns those items that we spoke about before, what the task is, what the hazards related to the task are, what the controls are, who and how they're going to be implemented. On the second page, if we can bring that one up, and this is talking about the people involved with performing the work and then sign on to it. So it's important that people are doing the work actually sign on and say, okay, I've read this SWMS, and that's why we want to keep it simple, because if it's 52 pages, they're going to turn to the back page and sign and not read it. Whereas if we keep it that 3 or 4 pages in that sort of sweet spot, it's more likely they'll read it, absorb it, and particularly if they've been involved consultatively in developing it, they understand and know what's in it. And that's why when we see handwritten SWMS and handwritten notes, it's usually a flag for us that that's the process that's been followed.
It's great to have your insight. Yeah. Sorry, please continue, Rick.
No, that's all right. I was just going to say, and just keep the SWMS to the SWMS. So it's a little bit like you don't use a sieve to carry water. It's not designed for it. So use the bucket for that and the SWMS for the high-risk construction work.
Yeah, it's a great point you make. Really appreciate your insights today. I can see how important those safe systems of work are and what employers should consider when developing them and using them effectively in their workplaces. Rick, I'd love to jump to some questions now because there's a lot coming through from our audience. It's great to have so many people involved in this session today, and I'll get through as many as I possibly can. A lot of people asking this one, do I need a SWMS if I am doing one of the identified 19 high-risk construction work activities if I am not undertaking construction work?
Very good question. Technically, the answer is no. If you're not doing construction work, you don't need the SWMS. But our fallback would always be the SWMS isn't a bad tool to use in that instance because it's going to help you consider the controls and keep yourself and your employees safe.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This next one, what is the difference between a SWMS and a risk assessment?
Okay. A risk assessment's actually done as part of working out if something's... I love a term actually I'll go to that I heard on a site which they talk about the stickies, and it's an acronym for stuff that kills you. So if something's more risky or more likely to have a high consequence where somebody could be injured or there's going to be significant property damage, and there's a high likelihood of that being done, then there's a pretty good chance that that risk is then going to say, okay, we need to do a control to reduce that risk on site. Because SWMS is directly allocated at high-risk construction work, we've already said it's high risk. So you don't have to do the risk assessment to say, oh, this is high risk. If you're working above 2 metres, do a SWMS.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that, Rick. Lots of questions coming in. And this is one I've seen before in other years, so it's really good to clear this one up. Yep. What is the difference between a JSA and a SWMS?
Okay. A JSA is a job safety analysis, and it was pretty much the industry standard in Victoria prior to us moving to SWMS. Sometimes we're still seeing a generic SWMS and they'll staple a JSA to it. So the JSA is looking at the job safety analysis, so it's looking at the specific hazards associated with that site and that job. effectively the content of the JSA can be encapsulated into a SWIMS, or you might have a SWIMS and a JSA together.
Okay, that makes sense there. This one, continuing on with that, we're getting lots of questions, so please keep them coming through. Yep. If you are listening. I'll get as many to Rick as I possibly can. This one, I get asked to provide a SWIMS for a site. However, we don't undertake high-risk work. Do I still complete a SWIMS, or should this be covered by a work procedure?
I think the short and easy answer, if it's not high-risk construction work, it doesn't need to be in a SWIMS. A safe work procedure is the perfect spot for it. And that comes back to providing and maintaining a safe system of work, which is the legal requirement of a duty holder.
Now, you touched on this a little bit in what you've said before, but just a clarification from this question. Will WorkSafe encourage SWIMS to be less war and peace, in inverted commas, and more focused on only high-risk tasks? SWIMS have grown out of control.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what we were speaking before about, Cameron. So look, if you're Tolstoy and you're doing the work, you might write War and Peace, but everybody else, please don't. For us, what we want to see is short, succinct, simplified SWIMS that address the high-risk construction work. A lot of some of our larger sites will actually ask for a whole lot of that stuff in. Our recommendation is you have a safe work procedure or set document that accompanies your SWIMS documents. So the SWIMS are specific to the high-risk construction work, and it's a little bit like what we're saying, keep the right tool for the right job.
Flowing on from that, Rick, how do you prevent contractors completing generic SWIMS without current dates that don't take in any of the current environmental risks?
Well, that's what happens when a WorkSafe inspector rolls up and we get to adjust their state of knowledge, that we say. And that can be done through improvement notices, prohibition notices, what's called a CRTOI, which is a contravention remedy at time of inspection, or for recidivists, those that keep doing it, then that can end up in a prosecution. And when you start looking at what the penalty units work out at, you can be talking several $1,000s.
Okay, great. Does WorkSafe have a downloadable list of things legally required for SWIMS to use out on site?
Yeah, just point straight to the guidance on our website. And if you type SWMS in the search bar, it brings up two items that you can download. One's a template and one's the guidance. The guidance has a list of how to put it together. The template actually has the 19 things included within the template.
Great, thank you. This is an interesting one. Does a temporary public event site classify as a construction site and require a SWIMS for setup and pack down periods?
If they're undertaking what would be deemed as construction work in that activity, then yes, it would. There's also something called the Equipment Public Safety Act that we work under as well. And sometimes things will fall under that. In general, though, it still goes back to that general duty of providing a workplace that's free of a risk of harm to health and safety.
Rick, this next one, just a few people wanting, I think, a little bit of clarification around JSAs that you touched on before.
Yeah.
Can a SWIMS provided by a contractor replace the need to also complete a JSA before work commences?
I would say yes, it can, but it's going to be case-by-case basis. And at times it's going to depend. So a subcontractor is working into a principal contractor or another contractor. That's a little bit of that relationship between those two entities. Our expectation is always going to be high-risk construction work, do a SWIMS. Those other items, if it's not going to clutter the SWIMS and it's 2 or 3 things, pop them in. But anything more than about 3 or 4 pages, the SWIMS starts to become very difficult to work and it's less effective. So then it becomes a separate piece of work. Okay,
great. Another one just needing a little bit of clarification. I think a few people asking this. If a task is being performed on a regular basis, should a safe work or operating procedure be developed in preference to a SWMS?
If it's high-risk construction work, it needs to be a SWMS. Okay, that one's pretty cut and dry. And where it becomes an issue is because it's got to be site-specific. So you might be doing the same thing, but not every site's the same.
And I reckon you've touched on this a bit, but again, I just want to make sure we get all the clarifications in because a few people are asking it. How detailed does the SWMS need to be? Does it just need to show the high-risk work?
Okay, it needs to show the high-risk work. So as an example, we might say roof tiling is the work. The task, the hazard is fall from heights and dropped objects would be the two sort of main hazards you'd be looking there. Then we want to see the controls in place. The control needs to be detailed enough that the people operating and doing the work understand what they need to implement in that control. So if it says a proprietary system of guardrail installed prior to work at height commencing, ladders provided with ladder guides and set up with a 1 to 4, top and bottom secured, that's the sort of detail we'd sort of be looking for. And then when you look through those things, you're saying, well, whose role is it to implement that? And that role would normally be the supervisor of that crew that's doing it. In some cases, it's going to be the builders going to take the duty to put that rail up before the tilers get to site, as an example.
That's a good example. I'm going to keep the clarifications coming for you, Rick. Please, everyone, keep sending your questions in if you're a little bit unsure of a couple of points that Rick's been talking about. But this one, is a SWMS the same as a SOP, standard operating procedure?
Yes and no. Sorry, that's not a great clarification. A standard operating procedure is how I do something the same way every time. So whereas a SWMS is specific to high-risk construction work at a specific work location. So an SOP tends to be a little bit more overarching, whereas a SWMS is like that very narrow focus.
Christopher sent this one in, but a lot of people are wanting it answered as well. What is the definition of construction work? For example, does reactive maintenance fall under construction work?
Look, that's a great question, and we've just actually had a bit of chat with legal about that on a particular site. Reactive maintenance can be deemed as construction work in some circumstances. So it's basically if the elements and the undertaking of the work fit within the definition of construction work as per the regulations, then we would expect that it would be treated as construction work in that instance. Also, then if that work or that construction activity is beyond the $350,000, then the O&M operator that's doing that work would also take on the principal contractor responsibilities for that piece of work. Now, that doesn't mean that it applies to their entire O&M contract, but to that specific piece of work it does.
Okay, that makes sense. Rick, this one, can SWMS be used in other industries other than construction?
Look, they absolutely can, but they don't have to be. So construction is the specific for, it says it in the title, it's high risk construction work. But if an arborist, as an example, is working at height and wants to develop a swim for how they're doing their arbor work because they're working above 2 metres, there's no reason they can't use that methodology. So that goes back to a safe system of work. So there's no reason it can't be adopted outside of construction, but it's not legally required.
Okay, thank you for that. This one from a few people. With the WorkSafe SWMS template, it does not include a rating matrix to determine inherent and residual risk scores. Is this no longer required?
Within the jurisdiction of Victoria, it is not required. So I'd be very clear about that. And the reason I say that is that some of our principal contractors operate in multiple jurisdictions in Australia, and there are some jurisdictions that are still looking for that. The reason that we removed it as being required, it can optionally be there, but it's very subjective. So 2 people looking at the same risk will come up with different ratings. And we've already said it's high-risk construction work. We know it's high risk. We don't need to sit down with a matrix and argue about if it's a 1B or a 2C or a 3C for an hour and a half. Let's say it's high risk. These are the controls. How are we going to fix and reduce the exposure of our employees to getting hurt? And once we've implemented that, I don't need a residual. Has it resolved the issue, yes or no? And then when the guys go to site, if they're doing something and you go, this SWIMS isn't controlling that risk, well, that's when they should revise and review their SWIMS.
Okay, great. Thank you for that, Rick. This one, contractors often make up their own template, which may or may not contain all elements of the WorkSafe template. Do these still comply with the regulations?
Yeah, there's no issue with somebody developing their own SWIMS. I would push them back towards our guidance and make sure it ticks the elements that are listed in the guidance. So the guidance, if you're following the guidance, you're deemed to be compliant with what's in the regulations. That's why we provide guidance, and because it's a simplistic format to allow people to understand what's in the regulations, which can be a little bit tricky to understand at times.
I think this one a really important one, and that's not to say all our questions aren't really important, but how much knowledge does someone overseeing the high-risk work need to have of the SWIMS?
To be brutally honest, they actually don't need to have any knowledge of it. So and when I say that, if they're the principal contractor, so the contractor doing the work, they need to have the knowledge, them and the people doing the work. Principal contractor might have grown up through the bricklaying trade and become a principal contractor, and he's reading a SWIMS from an electrician. He's not going to necessarily understand the exact content, but he's got a duty to ensure that that SWIMS is actually prepared prior to that high-risk construction work beginning. I hope that answers that one.
Yep. No, that makes sense to me. This one here, in the industry I work in, we are not construction, but we do work off ladders and EWPs at times. Do we need to do a SWIMS for this work?
So if it's not construction work, then no, you don't. But again, as I said earlier, it's not a bad template for guidance. The other things that I would refer you to is look at our website. We've got lots of guidance on working from ladders. We've got some, I think, 4th edition of our EWP guidance has just been published, and those compliance codes allow you to work safely using that type of equipment, even whether you're in construction or not.
This next one, I'm going to just assume, which I possibly shouldn't, so correct me if I shouldn't, but it's referring to forklifts on a construction site, so a bigger construction site. Is a SWIMS required for operation of forklifts? Can a controller of a site require one to be completed prior to operating a forklift or bringing one to site?
Yeah, they reasonably can, because it's powered. It comes under the 19, there's the movement of powered mobile plant on site. So a forklift is considered as powered mobile plant. And that that includes things like forklifts, telehandlers, excavators, EWP. They all come under that powered mobile plant.
Great. Thank you, Rick. This one, do we need to complete a SWIMS for repairing machinery on site?
It's a good question. I would have thought in general, no, that it doesn't really meet one of the 19. In saying that, if you're then adjacent to a roadway, well, suddenly now one of the 19 does come in, or if you're doing it at height, or if it's near an energised circuit. So it's got to be taken in context to the site, which is why SWIMS are site-specific.
Great, thanks for that question, John. This one's from Sharon, Rick. If a contractor is coming on site to complete a project which involves high-risk construction work, who has overall responsibility for the SWIMS?
So the contractor coming on has a responsibility to consultatively prepare the SWIMS. The principal contractor has a duty to ensure that SWIMS has been prepared prior to that high-risk construction work proceeding.
Okay. Now, you might have alluded to this in our conversation a little earlier, but again, just if you could clarify, do SWIMs need to be available on site in paper form? Can they be accessible in digital format?
They don't need to be in paper form. They can be electronic. But the caveat to that is if you need to adjust or edit them, if it's an electronic form, it needs to be editable. Now, there are versions out there that are editable in electronic form. Sometimes it might be you've got your electronic form and you just use a sheet of paper and write the revision and keep it with it if it's not editable. So you still need a method to be able to review and revise.
Okay, great. This one, do you need a SWIMS for testing energised equipment?
I think that would loosely fit around our working on or around energised equipment. So I would say yes. And I have to point out that some of these opinions are Rick's opinions, not necessarily the dotted I's and crossed T's of WorkSafe, and that's why I'd always push people back to refer to our guidance.
Okay. Danny wanting to know the answer to this one. What do I do if a principal contractor asks me to complete a SWIMS for work that is not high-risk construction work?
You can smile and nod and do it if it's going to make your job easier, but you could also just provide them with a work process if you already have one for that work. What the principal contractors are in general, they're trying to look at reducing their liability for somebody doing something in an unsafe manner, and they've got so they're doing their due diligence towards having a safe system of work on site and making sure that they're reducing the likelihood of harm to workers on site.
Great. I want to keep going with some of these questions, Rick, because we've got so many coming through. I'm conscious of time a little bit, but I'd love to get to as many as I possibly can. This one, usually SWIMs are very generic. A master copy is kept by a contractor. Is it acceptable or a specific one needed every time a project starts?
Yeah, look, I'm pretty comfortable we answered that earlier, Cameron, but you can, if you have a generic one, that's great. Start with your generic, but then make it site specific. So you can't say, okay, today I'm going to be working on a pier out in Geelong Harbour, and I'm going to use the same SWIMs that I was using for a farm just up the road, because the environments are radically different. So you have to take those site-specific hazards into account when you're doing your SWIMs.
That makes a lot of sense. This one from a few people. For near chemical, fuel or refrigerant lines, what specifically is determined as near? Is there a practical measurement that must be considered?
I can definitely answer that and tell you I don't know. So personally, I don't know, but it would be defined, I would believe, in the standards. So people need to look at the relevant standards when they're doing some of these things. And a lot of those are pointed to through our guidance, and not so much in legislation normally, but certainly within the codes of compliance.
Great, thanks, Rick. Does all housing and commercial electrical work require a SWIMS?
If it's construction work that's electrical and it's on or adjacent to energised circuits, then yeah, absolutely.
Great. What is WorkSafe Victoria's opinion of generic statements for controls such as use appropriate PPE?
So I think we can remember the hierarchy that we looked at earlier. PPE is at the bottom of the pyramid, and really PPE is in general not the control we're looking for. So this is where things like adjusting a person's state of knowledge through an improvement notice might ask for a higher order of control.
Okay. I might need your help with this next one, just so I get the question right. Would a safety auditor entering a construction site require a SWIMS or to sign onto site SWIMS?
If the safety auditor coming onto site is going to conduct high-risk construction work, then yes, the expectation would be that they would sign onto the SWIMS specific to that high-risk construction work. If they're escorted on site, which a safety auditor normally would be, that would come back to the site's general induction requirements and how they're managing that. And an auditor in general would not be conducting high-risk construction work. So they certainly may request visibility of SWIMS because that's a part of the safe system of work that they're auditing.
Okay, great. This one here, just from a few people, Rick, some builders or clients reject this template you've shown, requesting to have risk ratings, etc., as opposed to keeping it simple with relevant controls.
I'd provide them with a copy of our guidance and also provide our advisory number that they can ring and get advice about it. So our guidance is pretty clear that it's optional, it's not required. There are going to be cases where you may get a principal contract that's going to push really hard for it to a point that someone will capitulate and put it in there, but it's not required. So it does overcomplicate it and it doesn't necessarily achieve a better outcome.
Okay, this one, should construction SWIMS include silica dust as a high-risk activity, or would a separate crystalline silica hazard control statement be sufficient, or both?
Okay. Yes and no, probably. There's a little bit around that. So with crystalline silica work, if people are undertaking what's called a crystalline silica process, which is something that cutting, grinding, that's creating a dust plume or so forth from the material that they're working on, they should have a crystalline silica control plan in place. Now, similar to asbestos, that can be encapsulated within SWIMS.
What does WorkSafe Victoria do when they encounter a 25-page SWIMS, which are demanded by some principal contractors prior to coming to site?
Well, it comes back to the effectiveness of the SWIMS. So if that was written 3 months prior when they were tendering for that contract, chances are its best place is in the round receptacle called the bin, because it's quite likely no longer relevant to the conditions on site. To me, I think the tender process should be ensuring that SWIMS are produced as per our guidance in a consultative manner by the people undertaking the work for that project, and that they are presented prior to commencement of high-risk construction work. That approach would then tick the box for doing the tender to say, yes, these guys do a SWIMS, they do have a process, but on the day they're turning up with something that's relevant, and it may turn up a day or so before if they've had a chance to go to site and assess.
Great, Rick. I think we might have to leave it there with the questions. Thank you so much to everybody who was sending questions in. I do apologise I wasn't able to get to them all. If you do want
questions, yeah,
there were, Rick, absolutely. And if you do want more information, if I didn't get to your question, to put it to Rick, please use the advisory line to get an answer to any of those questions that you do need. Rick, really appreciate you explaining how safe work method statements can provide a systematic process of evaluation and managing the potential risks that's maybe involved in an activity. Absolutely vital if you were to keep workers safe in that high risk construction work that you've been talking about. Thank you so much for joining us today, Rick.
Thanks, Cameron. Great to catch up and be a part of this.
I really appreciate your time. We hope that everybody has found this an interesting and informative session. We're also going to note on the screen shortly a list of the contacts that have been mentioned and that you may find helpful. If you do have any requests for further information, we ask that you do get in touch with us. And remember, if there is something you need to discuss urgently, or if you need one of those answers to the questions I wasn't able to get to, please use the WorkSafe advisory line and the emergency line. It's been a big month for WorkSafe's Health and Safety Month, with plenty of visits to regional Victoria and these webinars. So thanks so much for everyone that's been involved in Health and Safety Month in putting it together. So many people's engagement in tuning into these webinars and coming to visit us throughout the regional centres in Victoria throughout the month of October. Please, everyone, stay safe out there. Thanks for joining us and have a great weekend.